So sometimes you will get questions where you have to complete the square to find the vertex, and there will be decimals involved. The steps are all the same, but sometimes the math gets a little bit trickier, so I'm going to go over an example. The first step is to, again, common factor the coefficient, so just the number, the coefficient of the x squared term from the first two terms. Don't factor out the x. So the coefficient is negative 0.25. Don't factor out the x, so you're just going to factor out the negative 0.25 from the first two terms. When you're common factoring, remember what you're actually doing is just dividing by negative 0.25. Just out of the first two terms. So the negative 0.25 is on the outside. And if you take that out of the first two terms, when you divide the first term by negative 0.25, you just get x squared. And when you divide the second term by negative 0.25, you get negative 1.6x. And then the negative 3 stays outside the brackets. Second step is we're going to take the coefficient of x, which here is negative 1.6, divide it by 2. Remember, it's always divided by 2, and then you're going to square it. So you're going to take this negative 1.6, divide it by 2, and square it. And negative 1.6 divided by 2 is negative 0.8, and when you square that you get positive 0.64. Now once again, take that 0.64, add it, and subtract it inside the bracket right there. So these steps are no different than they were when we didn't have decimals. And then we're going to add the 0.64 and subtract the 0.64. And then the negative 3 is still out there. Next step is to move the last term in the bracket to the outside of the bracket. So that negative 0.64 has to go on the outside of the bracket. But to do that, you have to multiply it with the negative 0.25. So it's basically like distributive property. So those two things get multiplied and then moved to the outside of the bracket. So what you've got here, the negative 0.25 stays on the outside. The x squared minus 1.6x plus 0.64 stays on the inside of the bracket, and that becomes the trinomial that you'll factor. Negative 0.25 times negative 0.64 becomes 0.16, which will get added to the negative 3. And that would give you negative 2.84. Now, here becomes the only tricky part to it. Other than that, all of the steps have been exactly the same. You just have decimals instead of integers. So the last part is we have to factor the trinomial inside the bracket. This is a simple trinomial. Once again, if you've done all the steps correctly, the two numbers that you find that multiply to 0.64 and add to negative 1.6 will both be the same. So you'll be able to get this x minus h squared. The question is, can you easily figure out what multiplies to 0.64 and adds to negative 1.6? So the easy way to do this is that obviously there's going to be an x in here. The number that goes there you can find in one of two ways. The first way is to just take the coefficient of the x term, which is this, and it's going to be half of that. So you're going to take half of negative 1.6, which would be negative 0.8. The other thing that you can do is you can take the square root of the constant term. So if you take the square root of 0.64, you get 0.8, and then you have to have the same sign as the middle term, which is this. So you take this sign and the square root of that number, and that's the same as this sign and half of this number. It's the same either way. So probably the easiest is to just take this middle number, the coefficient of x, and just divide it by 2. So negative 1.6 divided by 2 is negative 0.8, and that's what goes in the bracket. And that negative 1.6 came from here. And if you were trying to find out the vertex of this graph would be opposite sign, so it would be at 0.8 and negative 2.84. So method is all the same as before, just this last step to find that number in the bracket, just remember to take half of that middle number.